Maybe there's like two elements to the technological sovereignty question, which is, okay, one, you can build the technology that might, for example, bypass something like Google or Facebook or the banks, as in the case of Bitcoin, for example. Fine, you can build that technology, but the mere act of building it doesn't somehow then guarantee sovereignty. What you also need is authentic ways for people to have some say over that technology once it's built. So in the case of Bitcoin, you just don't have that, right? You have this protocol that's released out into the world that then a whole network of people go and use. But no individual person, the average user of Bitcoin, has any actual say in what that technology does once it's built. All they can do is either choose to carry on using it or to leave it. So it's just, the only option you have is exit, in the sort of like political distinction between, you know, exit and voice. Like you can only just like leave. You can't discuss. You can't say, actually, guys, should we maybe do something else? All right. In reality, the decisions in that system get made by a small group of technical developers. So the most interesting types of things would be one where you've built an actual technological infrastructure, but then you secondarily also build some authentic means for people to have a say in it. And that, for example, starts to look at stuff like direct democracy type governance platforms, maybe like voting platforms. So where you could say, okay, we got decentralized technology, but do we also simultaneously have a decentralized type of governance structure, or where people can actually, you know, make decisions collectively about the technology? And I guess if you contrast this to the existing technological setup, we have incredibly sort of centralized, giant sort of corporate beasts that produce the technology. So it's incredibly centralized, but then also the control is incredibly centralized. There's no, like, you know, you don't get to ask Facebook how it runs its operations, really. But the one thing you can actually say about groups like traditional, like, corporations is actually we do technically have means via which to actually influence them. Like if Facebook really started to abuse things, or if Uber, you know, these groups abuse things, you actually do have this route via which you can target the political system and say, please, can you regulate them? All right, so you actually do have these forms of autonomy, or forms of ways of shaping the technology, which is why I say with stuff like this decentralized technology, you often don't have that. Like you actually just have you've bypassed the big intermediaries, but without simultaneously providing a means to. If you think about money systems, they are, whether you like the dynamics of money systems or not, de facto they are the means via which networks, economic networks, interact with each other. It's how you can take, you know, hundreds of thousands of people who are essentially strangers, and enable them to engage in transactions with each other. That's what the money system's all about, right? It's about how do you know, at least at some level, that's what it's about. And a lot of the political dynamics of money systems are who gets to govern them, and at what scale you want them to operate at. So this is one of the big issues with the Eurozone. This is creation of this sort of meta-national structure with very ambiguous dynamics of who gets to control it. So a lot of the politics of money reform involve not only, for example, targeting the role of commercial banks and stuff in the money systems, but also at what scale you want these systems to operate at. So for example, you've got a whole range of these kind of like local currency systems, which all basically just say, hey, we want to reduce the scale of money systems a lot because that will essentially give us more autonomy over how we control our money system. The alternative is you can go these like meta-national, like transnational money systems like Bitcoin, which give you potential access to like huge economic networks, but offer the person very, very little ability to actually, they can be very, very alienated in those systems. So a large part of the dynamics of money is like, what scale do you put it at, and then what political structures do you build around the system to essentially, I mean, who gets to decide how much money gets issued on the monetary policy and all that kind of stuff? And that has a huge impact on people's lives. So when you're trying to think about sovereignty, money systems by default are an incredibly massive element of that, although it's frequently underappreciated. So, I mean, there's different conceptions of blockchain. The reason why it tends to be associated, as far as I can work out, with the libertarian right is that in the libertarian right, there's a critique of the state. There's a centralized organization or sort of centralized power. But the thing in libertarian philosophy is that you need that power in order to underpin property rights. So in the traditional libertarian conception, it's like, okay, fine, I have a state, but it's got to be really, really small. And it can only protect property and your life, which is often perceived as a form of property as well. All right? As soon as it does anything beyond that, it's kind of overstepping its role. But the problem in libertarian philosophy then, of course, is that actually it's like, well, but the people who run the state are people. And therefore they want to meddle in things, and they want to change stuff, and they want to corrupt things. And there's all this kind of idea that human nature then corrupts this thing. So when the blockchain came around, it was suddenly viewed as, oh, here is an infrastructure that can protect property rights and contract, but without relying on human beings. So it was kind of presented as a sort of ultimate liberation architecture. But of course, as soon as you've eliminated the sort of state body, again, you can end up with this tyranny of decentralization, which is basically you're all now locked into this technological platform that you have no say over. Okay, so now you become dependent upon, essentially technology elites rather than state elites. But there is, at the same time, these kind of communitarian, you might call it readings of blockchain technology, which say, okay, well, what has been created here is the potentiality for networks of people to organize themselves. And that's kind of given rise to this, the sort of more, left-leaning interpretations of it. And actually, interestingly, with blockchain, while on paper, a lot of the people who are within that scene call themselves libertarians and, sort of we'll talk about libertarian philosophy, in practice, the act of using blockchain technology is often creating these weird ideological hybrids where what they say and what they do is starting to diverge. So you find these weird mixes where suddenly all the kind of libertarian elements of blockchain community, you keep on talking about the community and forming consensus among people, which has got nothing, no original libertarian philosophy has got anything to do with forming consensus between people. It's all original libertarian philosophy is all just people will act in their own interests, and then stuff will work itself out. So you're finding these ideological contradictions, and that's kind of why I find blockchain interesting, because it's very easy for radical academics or left-leaning academics to critique it and say, oh, we've worked, this is just another extension of hyper-capitalism. And maybe that's true, but it's also the case that actually in using that technology, people can unexpectedly find themselves acting in new ways. One powerful element of blockchain technology is that it actually captures people's imaginations, young people. There's something kind of and I'd be reluctant to ignore that. So that's why I think the technology is quite important to, it's potentially an interesting vehicle to capture people's imaginations with, even though in the process of doing that, you can easily fall into these traps of just pushing out hyper-libertarian types of ideals. But there's definitely this thing where you can get lots of people excited about it. It's a new vision. It's not relying upon stuff that people's parents used to talk about old unions or cooperatives and these things, which are very valid forms of political organization, but it's hard to mobilize people around them at this particular state and time. And I definitely think it would be a mistake to ignore the technology and not try to essentially, co-opt the vision of it towards a more egalitarian vision. And I think that's the real, the reason why I spend time in the blockchain community is to say, okay, how would we take this, create an appealing vision for people to, I guess, organize at scale forms of a sort of collaborative economy. At the same time, though, I mean, I recognize the limitations of that. I mean, somehow you're not going to like change the entire economic structure through like, you know, digital cooperatives on blockchains, but it's worth exploring. Yeah, I mean, the war on cash is just, I mean, it just basically refers to the digitization of money systems. I mean, it doesn't really refer to that. It refers to the removal of the option to use cash, which by default then just means you're using the bank payment system. In our world right now, you've got basically like two ways of implementing a money system. You either implement it via physical tokens, or you implement it via essentially digital tokens. All right, and already most of our money systems digital tokens. Your bank account is that's what your bank account is. It's essentially database entries, recording your money tokens, keeping score of them. And actually, money systems have always had these two means of being implemented. The type of like the physical object version of money versus the what you might call data objects, where somebody basically writes it down for you in a book, or even on some clay tablets, or nowadays on a hard drive in a computer. So what's referred to as the war on cash is essentially the attempt to remove the physical token form of money and move exclusively to a ledger or database form of money. And de facto right now, our database forms of money are controlled by the commercial banking sector. So when we say the cashless society, what we're basically talking about is the bank payments society. And of course, there's a bunch of political agendas and commercial agendas behind that. On the one hand, the payments industry and the financial industry have a massive commercial interest in pushing for cashless society, because basically cash transactions are, for the payments companies, are transactions that they don't make money off, or they can't take a cut of it, basically. For the banks, who are obviously part of the payment system, or they underpin the whole payment system, they find it a hassle to have to like keep on stocking cash, right? And the thing about this to try and grasp is that right now cash is actually the only form of state money that you can access. This is kind of a subtle point. The money in your bank account is not state money. The money in your bank account is promises from a bank to give you state money, okay, which is technically a different thing. And that's why you can go to an ATM and withdraw cash, because what you're saying is, I'm going to convert my digital bank deposits into state money. All right. So what the banks want to essentially do is remove the option to do that. So you would not be able to actually hold money outside of the banking sector. How that then ties into sovereignty is like, well, that's a number of questions there. On the one hand, a cashless society is essentially a privatized money system. I mean, well, it's like a cross between, it's sort of like a public-private money system. We already have that, but like, it'll be a much more privatized money system than we already have. Okay, so in terms of your, you will be much more subject to the private banking sector than you were previously. Okay, so that's like one issue of sort of autonomy. A second issue is that as soon as you, the only means of transaction is via banking intermediaries or payments companies, you create giant data trails of all your transactions, which all will be recorded and therefore can be searched through and watched. So there's this whole issue around surveillance that's also becoming part of this question. And actually, if you think about transactions, they reveal things about people that are far more personal than any other form of stuff they reveal, for example, on social media. Like what you actually buy gives you incredibly anybody who has that data has got a very good idea of who you are. But then the third issue of sovereignty is also about the ability to manipulate people via the money system. Right now, ironically, the cash system actually hampers forms of monetary policy. Because cash is what you might call it's like an offline form of money, right? Like once you have it, it's there. It can't be remotely changed or remotely stopped. So once people have this form, they can actually engage in bilateral transactions on markets. You can go buy a coffee from a shop and so on without asking anybody's permission. But for central banks, there's this issue. It's like once that money's out there, we can't stop it or we can't change it. So, for example, if central banks want to push in negative interest rates, basically, which means they want to erode your bank deposits. Okay, so your money will essentially disintegrate away. They can't do that with cash, right? But they might want to do that to essentially coerce people into spending. Now, you might think that enhanced ability to manipulate people's spending is important in a state. But for many individual people, that feels like an attack on their sovereignty, their personal, this idea that you have this sort of like puppet master entity that sort of like pulls strings and makes you do things. So in that sense, this is also becoming a kind of issue of personal economic sovereignty. Like, should you have the ability to exchange without the money form being subject to remote editing? I don't know that's a really great way of putting it, but that's a very long answer to your question. The other issue on the politics of payment systems is that there's a big geopolitics to payment systems. If you look at, for example, in China, China UnionPay was the big, essentially, credit card network set up in China. And one of the main reasons why that was set up is that the Chinese government does not want American payments companies dominating, essentially inserting themselves in all the transactions that Chinese citizens engage in, right? Because right now you've got MasterCard and Visa are by default like the domineering players of the global international payments system, right? So you use their infrastructure to route messages through the banking system, essentially. And groups like MasterCard and Visa have enormous power to essentially censor transactions. So if you look at WikiLeaks, for example, when MasterCard and Visa decided that they didn't want to let people donate to WikiLeaks, they can essentially just choke an organization. If they decide that they don't want to process payments, well, you can essentially strangle an organization to death. Well, not only that, but you also prevent people from being able to actually act upon their own consciences. So people say, I want to donate something to WikiLeaks because I believe in it. Or they say, well, we're not going to let you do that, and we're also going to kill WikiLeaks. And that's essentially a huge power. And if you don't have democratic infrastructures around that system, well, you have all sorts of geopolitical stuff creeping into the payments industry. So that's why I guess, interestingly, stuff like Bitcoin has become geopolitically interesting, because actually that was one of the reasons why WikiLeaks could stay going, was via the Bitcoin system, because it's the only system that doesn't rely upon banking sector, essentially. Of course, it then will simultaneously open up networks for, like, you know, terrorist financing and crime and so on. But then again, the question you always ask yourself with these things is, like, do you destroy, as soon as you destroy alternative systems under the guise of trying to stop terrorism or crime, you simultaneously destroy routes for creativity and routes for political dissent. And this is the fundamental kind of tension. Do you want to keep those avenues for alternative sort of payments open, or do you want to live within a banking panopticon?